Hello, my name's Andy Ashworth. I'm speaking about work that I've done with Philip Dutton, who's a psychologist friend of mine who you'll hear more about during the presentation. Now about me. I'm a GP. I have 10 minutes for every patient, so whatever I do, I've got to be quick and properly organised. As a GP, I look after everything that comes through the door, so I've got to keep my understanding quite simple. Now, about 5 years ago, a friend, Philip Dutton, was just back from Sandy Hook where there'd been a shooting. He went not for the immediate aftermath, but went for the anniversary of the shooting. So he went and he helped out the folk in Sandy Hook who had lost their relatives, who had lost their way of life. But that wasn't why I went to see him. I went to see him because he makes great coffee. So I said, "Okay, Philip, how are you?" He said, "Well, I'm okay," he said, "but I've got to speak to the press. The BBC were on this morning, they're fairly straightforward, but I'm speaking to a tabloid, The Sun, this afternoon. What am I going to tell them?" Now, the key was, it wasn't really about Sandy Hook. This was the day after a helicopter had crashed in Glasgow, which isn't far from where we are. He had to speak to The Sun. The Sun's a tabloid, it likes things simple. So we started looking at what might be simple. And he said, well, it's really all about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. So I scribbled on a piece of paper and I came up with an idea, which was basically to put victim-survivor into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But Philip said, no, I'd rather it looked like snakes and ladders. So ultimately we came up with this model of snakes and ladders and what happens when we're going through problems. You'll see that when somebody suffers a trauma, they go shooting down to the bottom left there. They feel disorientated and panicky. They seek orientation really towards the threat. When they've got clarity about the threat, they can actually feel like it's victim. But at that stage, you feel fear and anger. That's where the anxiety comes in. It's very attractive to be confused and to go back, but better to become calm and feel like a survivor. After that, we make our progress through the process of recovering from trauma. But let's just look at that first cycle to start with. Now, I've done work in addictions in the past, and there's a lot of work been done by a couple called Petrasky and De Clementi. They looked at there being a cycle of change, so that we first of all don't even bother thinking about what's going on. We call that pre-contemplation. Then we contemplate a change, we make a change, we keep the change, and then we relapse. And we can see that that actually fits into this model. So actually we're not at a particular place, we're in a particular cycle. And when we look at it, there are 3 cycles. Bottom one, a middle one, and an upper one. And those are the cycles that we have to transfer between as we're moving on through the journey of trauma. But quite often, for some traumatic reason, we end up stuck between 2 of these, the bottom cycle and the top cycle. And that leaves us here, feeling fear and anger. Or fear or anger. They're very much the same thing. Now let's move away from this theoretical psychological model now to look at the brain itself and what's going on in the brain. This is a model of the brain. You'll see that we have a limbic system, which is our emotional memory. The amygdala is kind of the smoke detector of the brain. But then I want to look at the effect on the organs, how things affect things lower down. So when we feel anxiety, generally speaking, we have triggers. And those triggers stimulate the limbic system, which in its turn stimulates the amygdala, the smoke detector. Now, as well as setting off stressful hormones, there's an immediate neurological connection to the body. Goes through the sympathetic nervous system, gives off noradrenaline at the organs, which actually prepares them for fight and flight. Here we can see that action going on. Now down at the organs, we have an interoceptive system. In other words, our brains can actually be aware of what's going on in our bodies. There are sensors down at the body, and they go up 3 different routes to an area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain. So information is passed to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now let's look at it. It also knows whether we're fighting or flighting, and if we're not, what is it going to do with that information? Well, it's going to turn it into feelings. That's the inevitability of the brain having to rationalize what's going on. Now, that's all very well, but other things can happen too. And there's a shortcut. You'll see in the yellow there, about halfway up just below the amygdala, is the panic shortcut. Goes from an area of the brain, which is a channel. It's called the periaqueductal gray. But there's a direct connection there to the amygdala, so that when the sensors stimulate that, we get stimulation of the amygdala. Now, how are we going to stop all this? Well, there's an area called the Edinger-Westbell nucleus. And that's the upper part of our parasympathetic nervous system, the calming down nervous system. So if we stimulate that, then we can calm down the senses in the body, and we can actually end up with a much calmer system. When the noradrenaline is balanced by the acetylcholine of the parasympathetic nervous system, the senses have nothing to report back, and so the cycle is broken, whether it's anxiety, anger, or panic. So how are we going to stimulate that special nucleus, the Edinger-Westbell nucleus? Well, let's look at where it lies. It lies in the midbrain. Here it is. And it lies between the oculomotor nucleus and the trochlear nucleus. So, if that's where it lies, what about stimulating them? If we stimulate the two together, the oculomotor nucleus and the trochlear nucleus, then maybe we can stimulate the Edinger-Westbell nucleus and actually get some parasympathetic activity. Now, there's been a group of people who for thousands, perhaps millions of years have been doing this. And so we feel it's a good idea to mimic them. Meet Anna. Anna's feeding here. And what she's doing is she's using her third cranial nerve and her fourth cranial nerve. Her right eye is being stimulated by the third to gaze up and out. And up and in is specifically a task of the fourth cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve. She's stimulating her parasympathetic nerve. So what if we start doing that with adults? We've come up with this idea of the baby gaze, and it seems to be very helpful. The thing about it is, it's easy to deliver. The patient simply feels their body. The pointer shows an eye position. And in my case, I use a timer to assist. The patient stimulates the third and fourth cranial nerves in order to achieve calmness. The system is safe and effective in children because there are no drugs and it can't do any harm. They've been doing it since they were born. So that's it. That's the baby gaze. Simple, efficient, quick. Most of all, though, effective and and the patients can do it themselves.